Hello, friends, and thank you as always for visiting the LSU Dynasties YouTube channel, the YouTube home of Legend Sports Universe, all-time dynasties all the time. The LSU is a collection of cross-era sports simulation dynasty universes featuring the all-time greats from sports history, utilizing out-of-the-park baseball, pro strategy football, franchise hockey manager, and title bout boxing, and will soon feature a basketball offering as well, utilizing draft day sports basketball. This video is the second in the Legend Sports Universe ESports Boxing Club Boxer Ratings project. This will feature 25 middleweights from throughout history. I guess it was about a week and a half ago I posted a video on the first in this series, 25 heavyweights that I rated. The project, again, is basically a formula-based project. I am not doing kind of hand-adjusted ratings at this point. I'm simply trying to come up with a formula that will closely rate fighters to where they should be rated, using a mix of actual career statistics, including compubox data, as well as ratings from the classic Title Bout Boxing game. So I've devised some formulas there. And again, once the game is released, all of these will be touched up a little bit. There's a lot we don't know about Esports Boxing Club, how they're going to do ratings. Some of these ratings I've had to kind of assume what they're going to mean for now. I'll touch on all of that as we go here. But right now, this is not a perfect final rating because we don't know what the traits are the guys are going to have. We don't know what the styles are going to be available to us. All the technical stuff that makes up a boxer and how they fight. So until I know that, I can't play test the game. So things will surely need some sort of adjustment, but this is kind of a very rough marker as to how these guys will be rated based on the formulas that I've created. The advantage of a formula setup is that it will allow me to turn guys out quickly once it's honed. So if you kind of consider this as the foundation for the ratings project, and then all the touch-ups that you would put on a quote-unquote house, will be done once I'm able to, play the game, get more details about some of the ratings, and obviously play test the game myself. So if you go into this with that in mind, what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the 25 fighters. I am listing them alphabetically rather than by rating. So if there's anyone in particular you're looking for, you don't want to watch the whole video, that'll probably come in about an hour or so. You can just kind of zip over to your guy. If a guy who you're looking for has not been rated yet, fear not. I'm sure he will be down the line. I'm going to go through all of the major weight classes and do 25 in each of the main classes, and then I'm probably going to do like 15 guys in each of the junior classes, junior middleweight down the line. We're going to try to do a class every week to 10 days or so. And hopefully at the end of that, we'll have a better idea of where Esports Boxing Club stands as far as release, maybe some more details on attributes that I can use to kind of, adjust these formulas a little bit and give us a little bit more of a jump start. But again, the formula setup is really designed to let me be able to really flesh out the fighter base once the game is released. The formula setup is not 100% perfect. I make no claim that it's going to be, but I think it's going to get close enough to where then little adjustments after that are going to get us into a good spot. So without further ado, we're going to go here again, 25 middleweights rated for the Esports Boxing Club game. So we kick off with Canelo Alvarez. You'll see here, and it's an imperfect rating, as far as the overall, because the overall currently, it seems to me, is based on everything equally. Which I really don't think is the best way to measure a fighter. But even so, if your guy gets over 90, he's really good. So Canelo settles in here at a 92. An important thing about the way I do this is this only factors in a fighter's fights in this weight class. So Canelo's stuff up until the Mayweather fight, which was his last fight at junior middleweight, isn't factored in here. The Bivol fight and his other stuff at super middleweight isn't factored in here. This is just his middleweight stuff, which started with Alfredo Angulo in the first fight after Mayweather and went through the Danny Jacobs fight. So it's basically based on punch data and ratings, his title bout ratings as a middleweight and punch data through those 8 fights. So you'll see here, He's obviously solid stamina-wise across the board. I actually did a modification on endurances from when I did the heavyweights. So all the heavyweights endurance is probably going to tick down a little bit. One of the things that I factor in is a fighter's record in fights that go past 8 rounds. And what I found as I started going through the middleweights was that I felt like I was kind of overweighing that. So I kind of minimized the impact of that, and I'm much happier with how it sits now. Canelo is funny because, he's such a polarizing guy, as anybody who reaches a certain status in pretty much anything. He's got his lovers who, will make excuses for anything he does wrong or act like he's perfect. And you'll have other people who hate on the guy for no real good reason, which is kind of silly. I feel like that happens more in boxing than anything else. One of the places where I think Alvarez's fans get a little bit overhyped on him is they kind of overrate his power. He's got good power. He does not have great power, especially in his middleweight fights. He only, he knocked out Kirkland, he knocked out Amir Khan, but those were his only 2 KOs. He had a TKO win over Angulo, but everything else went to the decision. So he's not an overpowering guy. You'll see his power settles in there in the 80s, his knockout power at an 84. That's appropriate for him. That is not a bad rating. One of the things that you'll see as I go through this is I try to use much more breadth of ratings so guys feel different. I think the biggest criticism I've ever had with sports games, which is if I play video games exclusively, pretty much it's sports games. But the biggest criticism of sports games is that everybody kind of feels the same and plays the same, and ratings don't really differentiate guys so much. So I always try to kind of fix that, for lack of a better term. Obviously, if once I'm playtesting and stuff like that, I see the difference between a 90 and a 92 is significant, I'll adjust things. But you're going to see knockout ratings and stuff like that for guys from the 60s all the way up into the 90s here. So that 84 is a very solid and very fair rating for Canelo. Up next, we have Vito Firmo, 70s champion and contender. Firmo probably best known as the guy who Marvin Hagler got his first title shot against. Hagler battered Firmo through a lot of that fight, and pretty much universally was regarded as the winner of that fight, except for the judges, who awarded Firmo the draw, let him keep his title. He ultimately lost it. Then, of course, Hagler beat Alan Minter to win the title, and then got his revenge, stopping Firmo in a 4th round TKO. But Firmo was a grinder. Literally, he was a sausage grinder, actually, before he started his boxing career. But he was just a guy who would put his head down, try to come inside on you, work the body, threw lots of punches. Not very refined as a fighter. You would see his defense rating there, the agility of a 68, the block of a 62. He would take his shots, and he was a tough customer. He would stand in there, but a good fighter will handle Firmo. If you go through the list of the top fighters who are included here, Firmo is down on the lower end of that. Again, the overall rating imperfect, but an 82, one of the lower ratings of the top 25 guys I've done here. Up next, Nino Benvenuti from Italy. Benvenuti, a middleweight champion, also a very strong junior middleweight. He will be rated there as well, as he won a title at junior middleweight also. He took 2 of 3 from Emile Griffith. The only 2 fights that CompuBox has put data together for Benvenuti on are his 2 bouts against Carlos Monzon. Monzon beat him both times, and that was really the end of things for Benvenuti. Terrific, slick fighter, solid defensively, good on the attack, not great power, but he was just technically a very, very sound fighter. One of the kind of forgotten guys, I feel like, in a division that, there's a lot of compacted guys in middleweight history. I feel like you're your elites, there's Hagler, there's Monzon, there's Sugar Ray Robinson, even though Robinson's really better at a welterweight. Um, Bernard Hopkins, and and I'm probably leaving somebody out there that I'm not thinking of right off the top of my head at the moment. But then there's that kind of next tier of guys, and I feel like there's a lot of guys compacted into that next group of top middleweights. And Benvenuti is a guy who I think deserves to be in that conversation. Get an opportunity to watch his work, particularly in the Griffith fights. I think some of that video is up on YouTube to get an appreciation for Nino Benvenuti. Up next, Chris Eubank Jr., who has kind of banked on his father's name a bit. Big deal in England, has never really reached what some people think his potential is, although others think that his kind of middling ground as a Euro champ, very fringe world contender is what his potential is. Biggest criticism of Eubank seems to be that he's kind of unmotivated, but he's got some skills. He's got some hand speed. I actually think his punch speed there probably should be a little bit higher than that 86. I think the formula may shortchange him a little bit. He could probably stand to be up around 90, somewhere between 89 and 91, and probably be fine. He's got a decent beard on him, but he's incredibly inactive. He was at middleweight, moved up to super middleweight, came back down to middleweight, doesn't have any fights on the horizon. He's 31. He's fairly inactive. He's only had, I think, 32, 34 fights, something like that. So he's just kind of a guy he's sitting on the boxrec rankings as number 2, I believe, in the middleweight division, and I'm not really sure why. So he's a guy I kind of feel like his skills are okay, but he's a middling guy. He doesn't have any great characteristic. He's I made a reference in the heavyweight thing where Tim Witherspoon came in at an 89. And I said that Witherspoon was kind of a soft 89 because there was nothing that was excellent there. There was just a bunch of stuff that was solid. And I think Witherspoon was a better fighter than Eubank, don't get me wrong. But I think Eubank is kind of a soft 87. He's solid, but there's nothing that jumps out at you and says, this guy is great at this and poses a real problem. And so Eubank was an interesting guy. And I'm realizing now, one guy who I didn't do, who I will do, who I probably should have done instead of Eubank, was Erisande Lara. So there will be a rating for him forthcoming, though he is not in this video. Up next, we have former middleweight champion Gene Fullmer. Fullmer defeated Ray Robinson for the title twice, actually, I believe. I know Robinson knocked him out in the rematch the first time, and they would meet later on in their careers. Fullmer was just an aggressive, powerful bull of a guy. He was considered dirty in many circles. He used his head a lot, used his elbows a lot. He fought in a reverse cross guard, and it's going to be interesting to see style-wise how ESBC handles that style. Fullmer is actually different than most guys who use that, like Foreman, Archie Moore, guys who you would know. He actually fought with his lead hand on top, whereas a lot of guys fought with their rear hand on top. But his style drove Robinson crazy. And Fulmer's going to be an interesting guy. And there are a few guys like this, some of them in this division who we'll get to later, guys who were physically strong but not punch power strong. And Fulmer was one of them. And it's going to be interesting to see if there's a way to have guys like that be strong but not knockout strong within the game. So Fulmer is a guy who it's going to take some good style work to make effectively, and hopefully it's possible. Up next, the incredibly slick champion Joey Giardello. Giardello was the middleweight champ 1963 to 1965. He would eventually lose the title to Dick Tiger. And Giardello and Tiger and others were part of that big kind of 50s to 60s when boxing was on regular TV all the time. Friday night fights started there, and Giardello was one of the main guys there. really good speed, accurate puncher, very hard to hit cleanly. He had a good chin. Giardello was a really, really solid fighter. He lacked power, which you'll see here is what brings his rating down a bit. He also cut fairly easily. That cut rating could actually probably even be a little bit less than an 85. Giardello was going to outpoint you, though. He wasn't going to knock you out. His knockout percentage for his career is something like 22%, 23%, something like that. He actually fought to a draw with the aforementioned Gene Fulmer in what I think only the highlights of that are actually available on YouTube. And it was just an ugly maul fest. They exchanged headbutts with each other, which was common in a Fulmer fight, and brutal to watch and not indicative of the fighter Giardello was. Up next, Triple G, Gennady Golovkin. I assume if you're watching this, you are well aware of Golovkin, so you don't need me to extol his virtues as far as his career goes. Obviously rated really well there. Again, the overall is a little bit deceptive. That's not a great gauge of fighters the way this is done because everything is valued equally. But still, if you're in the 90s, you're obviously a really good fighter. I actually think Golovkin could actually probably be a little bit higher once I do manual adjustments to him. His block rating should be a bit higher. He doesn't get hit with a huge percentage of punches, and he doesn't get hit clean very often. So I think that should probably be bumped up. A big thing for Golovkin is going to be if ESBC has any way to incorporate ring generalship, because Golovkin is great at that. He's great at cutting off the ring. He moves as aggressive as he is. He's not aggressive in the way that he comes just straight at you. It's a lot of angles, lots of diagonal movement. So he's incredibly effective that way and just puts his opponents in bad positions. And then, between the effectiveness of his jab and his vicious body punching, once he's got you in trouble, it's kind of hard for you to get out of it. So, but ring generalship is going to be a big deal on whether Golovkin fights effectively in this game as much as he should. That jab rating actually should come up a little bit too. His jab deserves to be better than the 86. So when the manual adjustments happen, that'll happen for him as well. Up next, we've got Emile Griffith. Griffith is best known as one of the best welterweights in history, but he was also the middleweight champion of the world. He also ended up holding a version of the junior middleweight title at one point. But Griffith is just an all-time great. He had terrific speed. He had terrific stamina. His move speed here at middleweight, even though his welterweight rating will be higher, but I feel like the decline there on his move speed should probably be a little bit higher than it is. That the drop is too significant from what his welterweight rating there would be. But you'll see his agility rating is great. His block rating is great. He wasn't hit cleanly very much. He had a terrific chin. Again, the great stamina. His power at welterweight will also be higher than this. I mean, he came up as a small middleweight. He was a natural welter. So when he fought Dick Tiger, he came in 10 pounds lighter in that fight and won a 15-pound decision against, Tiger was a great fighter. We'll get to him in a bit. He was old at this point, but many people feel he was robbed in his second fight, decision loss against Carlos Monzon. Just Griffith is an all-time great, well worth you taking a look at. Up next, we've got, in the interest of full disclosure, my all-time favorite fighter, and he is the highest rated middleweight here. Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Again, Hagler, a guy, not many people really need too much of an explanation on Hagler. He was so versatile. He was so well-rounded. His feet were absolutely textbook. He could throw every punch from both stances. That's going to be a big thing in this game, too, is the ability to switch stances and how effectively he does it. Because Hagler, when I talk about switching stances, I'm not talking about like Hagler coming out as a southpaw. He was naturally right-handed, but he fought as a southpaw. And in the first few rounds against Leonard, coming out and fighting orthodox exclusively. I don't mean switching stances like that. I mean switching stances within the moment, within the round, within the exchanges. Hagler did that regularly. He didn't come out and fight orthodox for extended periods like he did against Leonard. That's why that was such a shock. But within the course of a fight, Hagler would change stances regularly. He had thudding power. His knockout power, you see there is a 92, is solid. He will win more on an accumulation, but he still had the power to take you out with a shot if he wanted to. I mean, that one shot, he landed in the Hearns fight. And it's funny, if you're not really into, if you don't know Hagler's full career, but everybody knows that 3-round fight against Hearns, it's really not a great representation of the fighter that Hagler was. The best version of Hagler is earlier on in his career, from winning the title against Alan Minter, to fights through like Tony Simpson and stuff like that. And I think if you don't kind of know Hagler's full catalog, you just kind of see him as this, steadfast mauler like he was in the Hearns fight. But the prime Hagler was incredibly agile and fluid. He was on the balls of his feet a lot. He moved really, really well. He wasn't fast. But he was fluid. And he could fight in any way. He could slug it out with you, but he could box. He was very, very gifted technically. And that's the Hagler that I'm going to try to represent here. Up next, Thomas the Hitman Hearns. This is obviously the middleweight version of him. There will be a welterweight version of him as well. That is even better than the middleweight version. But I mean, Hearns was still a very, very solid middleweight. He was, for one thing, he was a big guy naturally, so carrying the weight was no problem. He moved all the way up to light heavyweight eventually. 6'1", he had a 78-inch reach. He had absolutely just devastating power. He was accurate. His chin was a bit susceptible, but I think it kind of gets overly criticized as a blemish on him. Look at the guys who Hearns fought, and he withstood an awful lot of shots from a lot of very good hitters and very good fighters. His stay at middleweight wasn't particularly long. He had 4 fights before the Hagler fight, and then 4 fights after the Hagler fight in the division. He ultimately had won the title, I believe it was from Juan Roldan, and then he lost. He got stopped in a fight where he looked great through the first 2.5 rounds, and then Iran Barkley caught him with a great shot, and that was the end of Hearns' night and the end of his run at middleweight. So, Hearns is definitely a better welterweight than a middleweight. He may actually be rated a tad highly at middleweight here, but still, he's Thomas Hearns, and he's getting a little bit of the benefit of the doubt ratings-wise, I think. So up next, we've got the executioner, Bernard Hopkins. Hopkins' longevity in the middleweight division is a key to where his standing is as an all-time great. Hopkins did not get hit cleanly much. He liked taking you into the deep end of the pool. He would wear you down. He was dirty at times. He was a mugger, a mauler, but he could be more technical than I think a lot of people give B-Hop credit for. Decent power, not huge power. But I mean, he had single punch knockouts. He dropped his knockout of De La Hoya, just a perfect liver shot. If you're looking for a liver shot in the history of the sport, Hopkins' shot on De La Hoya is one of them. But I mean, Hopkins benefits from, you kind of are what the record says you are, and he was at a weak time at middleweight. Remember, De La Hoya was blown up. His best win during his middleweight tenure was against Felix Trinidad. Trinidad was a blown up welterweight. But again, you can only fight the guys who are in front of you. Then he beat, good, solid fighters, William Joppy, who we'll get to momentarily. Joppy makes this list. Keith Holmes, Glenn Johnson. But I mean, Hopkins kind of came into that class right after, guys like Toney and McCallum and Nunn and Julian Jackson and Sambu Kalambe and those guys, who I think were better than anybody in the class that of the true middleweights that that Hopkins ended up fighting. But his record for his longevity, I mean, he's got 27 qualifying fights in my system here at middleweight, which is a tremendous amount. Most guys settle in somewhere in the teens. But I mean, his knockout percentage, straight knockouts, again, 10 count knockouts, not TKOs, was only 7%, but 59% once you add the TKOs into it. Got plenty of late decisions. He was fairly busy, 50 plus punches around. I mean, Hopkins was a good, solid, all around fighter who fought a style that an awful lot of people didn't like, but it worked. And his record and his longevity in the division and his 5-year, 4+ year reign as champion speak to that. So B-Hop, highly rated here, matches Hagler at 93, though I think Hagler would beat Hopkins had they fought. So next we move on to a guy who we just spoke about, William Joppy. Joppy, 3 times WBA middleweight champ between 1996 and 2003. Again, a weak time in the middleweight division. Joppy was a guy who was kind of solid, I guess is the best way to put him. He's not going to be the top contender. Good punch speed, good hand speed. His defense wasn't great. His chin was a bit suspect. He had decent pop in his punches, although he was not a knockout guy. He accumulated a good amount of knockouts, so he did his damage. Joppy is a guy who I feel like one of the things that's really going to come into play here, we talked about ring generalship and intelligence and how ESBC is going to be able to incorporate that. Joppy, and several people have mentioned this over the years about him, was not a particularly intelligent fighter. He didn't have a heck of a lot of adaptability, and he did the same things all the time. He always had his hands low, for one thing. He was pretty predictable with his combos. His fight when he got pummeled by Felix Trinidad, when Trinidad moved up and beat him, Joppy, I don't think Trinidad missed a left hook that entire fight. He was just drilling Joppy with it, and Joppy would get, hammered and then get up and go through the exact same thing. And in different degrees, the Trinidad one's the most glaring, but in different degrees, you would see that from Joppy in the course of his career. And I think one of the things with ESBC is, are they going to have a way where a guy's intelligence is going to have an impact, in the AI? That discipline rating, we're still not sure exactly what that discipline rating is. I'm kind of inclined to think that it's really going to be more about fouling and stuff like that, but I'm hoping that it might have something to do with adaptability and ring generalship and that kind of stuff, and fighting intelligently. And if it does end up being that, then that'll be adjusted accordingly. That brings us to the Raging Bull, Jake LaMotta. LaMotta, a fan favorite. There are similarities to Arturo Gatti from the perspective of being able to take punishment and continue to go. But they didn't really fight the same kind of style. So kind of their ability to take punishment is really the only real basis for that comparison there. LaMotta could go all night. He had an iron chin, high work rate. He was constantly throwing. He's an effective body puncher. He worked the body constantly. I just don't think you could really call him a great body puncher because he didn't have the power to do it. You've got other body punchers, guys like Mike McCallum, who probably could have been rated at middleweight here. McCallum's going to be rated as a junior middleweight, but I mean, the body snatcher is, arguably the best body puncher in junior middleweight history. Tony Zale who will also be on this list. Tony Zale was a great body puncher also. LaMotta worked the body fearlessly. He would just lower his head, come in on you, and just start firing hook after hook after hook. It drove Ray Robinson crazy. He fought Sugar Ray Robinson 6 times, and they were good fights. LaMotta only won one of them, but they were highly entertaining, and he posed a problem for Robinson. He tested him, and his body work was a great deal for that. So seeing one of the things, again, and I've touched on this a few times, style-wise, is the styles and the habits and the traits that will be there for how a fighter fights. Is how you handle a fighter being more of a body puncher than a head hunter and stuff like that, and how ESBC incorporates that, which I'm sure they will to some degree, is going to be key in making LaMotta the best representation of LaMotta. Next on the list, Sergio Martinez. Martinez will also be rated at some point at junior middleweight. Here he is at middleweight, though, 4-year reign as the middleweight champion before ultimately losing to Miguel Cotto. Martinez is a unique guy. I always liked Martinez as a fighter, but he certainly had flaws. He moved a lot. He had a lot of punch output. He was ranked, he was somewhere in the mid to high 50s as far as punches per round. But he was off balance a lot. He had good speed himself, but again, with all that movement, he was off balance a lot. He was susceptible to the knockdown. He was knocked down several times in his career, even in his relatively short, not so much a short stint, but an infrequent fight stint at middleweight. I mean, he was at middleweight for several years, but he's only got 10 rated fights as I've got it designated for him at middleweight. So, I mean, he was dropped by Paul Williams in their first fight, although the best knockout of Martinez's career was him absolutely starching Williams in the rematch in the second round. But he was dropped by Macklin. He was dropped by Chavez Jr. So, I mean, that's being dropped 3 times, and that's not including the TKO loss to Miguel Cotto. And I don't remember. That's right. He was knocked down in the first Williams fight. I don't remember if he was knocked down in the Cotto fight. But so Martinez took a lot of punishment, was susceptible to the knockdown, but he had good speed. He had good power. He was a talented guy all across the board. He's the kind of guy, and there are several guys, of course, who when you play the game, Martinez is going to be a guy, if you fight to his strengths and show a little bit of caution so he doesn't get hit as much as perhaps in real life, you can do damage with a Sergio Martinez. Just have to stay away from the weaknesses, but a very, very good fighter. Whenever the discussion about the best middleweight ever comes up, this guy is always in the conversation. Carlos Monzon, 7 years as the middleweight champion, 14 defenses. Monzon's early and even to his mid-career was filled with, guys like Julio Cesar Chavez used to be criticized. I think it was Greg Haugen who said it about him, as beating cab drivers. And Monzon fought an awful lot of no talent guys in building up that impressive record of his. But he then fought plenty of really good guys and still came out on top. Monzon was great. He had an excellent chin. His style, he had high punch output. His jab was always there. Making Monzon effective in this game, we talked about a few times about activity level and stuff like that being something that ESBC has to nail. For me, I feel like the biggest thing to get right in a fighter, to make a fighter accurately, is you have to have their punch output right, as far as their activity level, number of punches they're throwing around right, and their use of the jab has to be accurate. If you have a fighter who regularly throws 50% 50 to 60% of his punches were jabs, as was the case with Monzon, and you create him and you can rate him fine and whatever, and you can make him look like Carlos Monzon. But if he goes in there and he's throwing 20 to 25% of his punches as jabs, well, at that point, he's not Carlos Monzon. So you've got to be able to get the punch output accurate. in doing a fighter properly. Monzon's jab was always there. It was frequently a show me jab, just kind of putting it out there, keep pawing and snapping, keeping his opponents at a distance, keeping everybody measured. But that was a huge part of what Monzon was. So his punch output was high. He had deceptive speed. He had deceptive power too. Not huge power, obviously, not big knockout power, but he could hurt you when he had the chance. As I mentioned, I use CompuBox data in these formulas, and Monzon is one of the older fighters who they went back and recorded the data from. And Monzon is somebody who his connect percentage wasn't actually that high, and his opponent's accuracy was, his opponent's land percentage wasn't high either. Both averaged out in the mid 20s. You could lower Monzon's accuracy there. I'm a little bit apprehensive to do that, though, because I want to make sure that he is, accuracy isn't just landing, isn't just making contact. Accuracy is also making kind of pinpoint contact, in effective contact. So I worry that by dropping him too much, I may minimize the effective contact that he made when he was throwing. As the percentage of punches that he lands, not enough of those will be effective, and that's what I don't want to do. So playtesting will sort that out when the time comes. So up next, a modern guy, Jamie Munguia, who I concede I did not have much knowledge about. Seeing him again as high as he is on the middleweight list on boxrec. He's 40-0. He's got 32 knockouts. His competition has been very suspect. He pretty much collapsed after the weigh-in for about earlier on this year, and there were known issues about him trying to make weight. It kind of seems like he's vacated the middleweight division at this point. That's a lot of what you're hearing, and now he's going to move up to 168 from 160. He's got a lot of hate. As I tried to look up and read more about him in addition to watching a couple of his fights and learning a bit about him. He's got a lot of criticism as a guy who is being protected by by Golden Boy. He had opportunities to go and try to challenge for titles at middleweight, and he didn't. He wasn't making a real push for them, so there's a feeling that they'd rather have him continue with his undefeated record than fight somebody for a title and lose that undefeated record. So I'm open to a bit more, interpretation from people about Munguia. On the surface, from what I know, I kind of feel like he's a touch overrated here. But again, his numbers are a little bit padded just because his competition hasn't been anything. There are lots of people who are calling for him, and it's actually somebody who is an oversight on my part, and I will ultimately do a rating for him. But Jamal Charlo, people wanted him to challenge Charlo for his title, and now it kind of seems like Munguia instead is going to move up to 168. But at some point, the guy has to fight somebody with with a little bit of a danger to him. Up next, one of my favorite nicknames, Michael Second to Nunn, the IBF middleweight champ for 3 years. He defeated Frank Tate for that title in 1988. He was ultimately stopped by James Toney in 91. That fight kind of changed both of their careers. Nunn was dominating Toney, who was undefeated at that point. And then Toney hit a perfect left in the 11th to drop Nunn. He got up. He wasn't really all there, and Toney finished him. And that was pretty much the end of Nunn's time as a top fighter, while it also really launched, Toney into kind of the next level of stardom as far as his career. At his best, I mentioned this in the forum the other day, at his best, Nunn was kind of like Roy Jones light. He was not Roy Jones. Don't don't think that I'm putting him on that tier, but it was kind of like if you tone everything about Roy Jones down a little bit, it was Michael Nunn. Um, Widely criticized as kind of lacking focus, and despite his success, he never quite seemed to really reach his potential. He was obviously a very good fighter. He's rated very well here. Um, but this is also kind of a bit of kind of peak Nunn. You will have fights where Nunn, if you lopped 5 points off of all these ratings, it would be more accurate for him. Um, but Nunn at his best was a very, very good fighter who many people feel he had the ability and the skills, if not the focus, to have been an all-time great. But Nunn's best work, he had good wins over Iran Barkley and Sumbu Kalambe and Marlon Starling. Those were very, very solid fighters. So if you get a chance to check out Michael Nunn's stuff, if you're not familiar with him, I encourage you to do so. The fight with Toney is a great one to watch for all of his skills, despite the eventual loss. Up next, we've got the Ghost, Kelly Pavlik, 40-2, 34 knockouts, a terrific middleweight champ. He's the one who beat Jermain Taylor after Taylor beat Bernard Hopkins and drove Hopkins out of the middleweight division. But Pavlik, he was a pretty basic fighter, had terrific power. He was very tall, so he had a really good reach, and he had explosiveness, particularly in that right hand. Great knockout power. I think his punch speed rating here is probably a little bit high in the formula. I think the title bout ratings love Pavlik, and I think he might be a tad too high there, which is why in the conversion thing, those title bout ratings are part of the formulas. But I kind of disagree with him a little bit on Pavlik. I think he's a little bit overrated, not much. But he was a fairly basic fighter. Decent skills, not great. Decent footwork, not great. But he had pop. He had a lot of heart. He suffered a lot of personal demons. He had a very, very big alcohol issue. And as such, he came into some fights where he was just not the peak form that he was capable of. The Sergio Martinez fight, Martinez is the one who took the title from Pavlik, and that fight took a lot out of Pavlik and kind of put him off the rails a bit. A very good immediate rematch with him and Martinez, if Pavlik was in peak form, would have been a good one to see. But Pavlik was a very, very solid fighter. Power was really his attribute. You'd have to fight him well to beat him, but he could be beaten. His best fight, actually, if you want to see it, isn't even his beating Jermain Taylor. Look up his fight against Edison Miranda, who was the setup for him to take the title from Taylor. We move on here to the great Sugar Ray Robinson. Robinson, look at that fight, the fight totals for him. 174, 19-6, 109 knockouts. He lost only one of his first 132 fights. He was only stopped once in his career. Robinson, I think his middleweight card here might be a touch overrated. That knockout power will come down if ESBC has a sort of finisher kind of rating. Because Robinson wasn't a huge hitter, but he was a terrific finisher once he got people hurt. So if there is something that kind of factors in for that, his actual knockout power rating would come down, as long as there is a trait or a special skill or whatever you want to call it that would kick in for him to be able to finish a guy once he got him in trouble. But I mean, Robinson had a great chin. He had good speed, great speed as a welterweight, but even as a middleweight, I actually think his speed here, even as a middleweight, could probably move up a touch. But Robinson, even though he was better at a welterweight, is still one of the all-time great middleweights, and it's going to be a long night if you're fighting against him once ESBC comes out. We move on next to Felix Sturm, another guy who falls under the category of a guy considered a very good regional fighter, but not an international fighter. From Bosnia, Sturm was a 3-time middleweight champion, but he's another guy who got kind of criticized for not ever really setting out to unify the belts. He was satisfied with being good and never pushing to be great. But a lot of people will stick up for him on that. He had a very controversial decision loss to Oscar De La Hoya when he came over to the States. And most people felt like he won that fight, and De La Hoya got the robbery decision against him. And they think that kind of set Sturm back from ever really wanting to push himself. He was satisfied to just be kind of a fairly well regarded, regional champion. Didn't have a lot of power, but very good technically, solid defensively, solid speed, accurate puncher. Didn't take too many risks. He was not an exciting fighter. But Felix Sturm was a very solid champ. And 42-6-3 you'll see there. But not many knockouts, and not someone who was going to really sell the big ticket. And again, that De La Hoya fight, a lot of people think took kind of some of the fighting spirit, the quest to be great, out of Felix Sturm, which is a shame. We move next to Bad Intentions, Jermain Taylor. Taylor, as we mentioned earlier on in this, defeated Bernard Hopkins for the title and then defeated him in the rematch. Easily the highlights of Taylor's career. He would ultimately lose the title to Kelly Pavlik. Taylor's an interesting one as far as how I do these ratings because, as I mentioned, I base guys' ratings specific to their performance in that weight class. So you'll see Jermain Taylor's chin rating there is a 90. Now, the only stoppage that he had when he was at middleweight was the fight where he lost the title to Pavlik. That loss, he never had the rematch with Pavlik. He moved up to super middleweight at that point. And then once he moved up to super middleweight, he got a win over Jeff Lacey, but then he was stopped by Carl Froch and then again by Arthur Abraham, and that basically put Jermain Taylor on the shelf for 2 years, and then he tried to mount a comeback. His two of his 3 fights after he moved out of the division were knockout losses, but that doesn't factor in here. So if you're somebody who wants to kind of go and feel like, well, his chin rating should be a little bit down because of those things, you could certainly do that. But the system the way I do it keeps that rating where it is. But if you wanted to drop Taylor to an 85 or something like that, you could certainly make an argument that you would be justified in doing so. Up next, another fighter from the old school Friday night fights time period, Dick Tiger. Tiger was the middleweight as well as light heavyweight champion. He will be rated there as well. 60, 19, and 3, 27 knockouts in his career. From Nigeria, he trained Nigerian soldiers in hand-to-hand combat before heading over to England to start his boxing career. Tiger is a guy, he was regarded, you can see in this picture there that he was chiseled. Not a big puncher, but physically strong. He could push you around the ring. He could rough you up inside. His footwork wasn't particularly refined, which a lot of people say is what took away his punching power. It wasn't a lack of strength. It was more a lack of technique. But he really ended up forging a great career for himself, fighting guys like Gene Fullmer, Joey Giardello, Nino Benvenuti, all champions in their own right who he defeated. And by the time he was all said and done, Dick Tiger was listed among the top fighters of all time and easily the top 15 or so middleweights in history. Up next, James Lights Out Toney. 77-10, 3 draws, 47 knockouts. He was a champion at middleweight, super middleweight, and cruiserweight, and had the heavyweight title, but was stripped of that because of a failed drug test. what's funny about Toney is that he gets spoken about as one of the great middleweights, but he actually was still developing at that point. I really don't think Toney really hit his peak until he moved up to super middleweight. But some of his middleweight fights, I mean, he drew with Mike McCallum, who was, although McCallum was at his best as a junior middleweight, McCallum was a terrific middleweight as well. But he followed up that draw by beating McCallum by a decision. He beat Michael Nunn, as mentioned earlier on, but that is a fight that Nunn was dominating Toney until Toney knocked him out. And even when Toney moved up to super middleweight, he fought Roy Jones. And obviously, Jones is one of the best ever. But Jones absolutely dominated Toney for that entire fight. So I kind of feel like history has kind of overrated Toney a bit, which is not to say that James Toney was not an excellent fighter, because he was. He kind of had the whole package. He had very good speed. He blocked punches well. He actually seemed like his chin almost kind of evolved, because he got knocked out a few times earlier in his career. So it's really probably not, it's not truly a function of his chin developing as much as his defense developing. Toney, very, very good off the ropes, one of the best ever off the ropes. Blocked punches very well, and a very, very solid fighter and a tough out for anybody, anywhere from middleweight up through cruiserweight. If you are going to do James Toney right in the ESBC, they've got to get the shoulder roll nailed down well. That's a huge part of Toney's style. But again, Toney, yes, I do feel like he was overrated a little bit, particularly at a middleweight. But I mean, at super middleweight, where he will ultimately be rated here as well, he's arguably the third best super middleweight all time behind Jones and Calzaghe. Coming down the home stretch here, we have Colombia's Rodrigo Valdez, champion in the 70s. He was the only person to ever stop Benny Briscoe, notoriously tough Benny Briscoe. Won the title from him. Valdez perhaps got his most notoriety, losing twice to Carlos Monzon, but that was a little bit later in Valdez's career. A powerful right hand. His right hand power, his knockout power rating here is accurate. I feel like his right hand power rating should probably go up. His speed rating may come down a little bit, as far as particularly his ring movement speed. But Valdez was an excellent combination puncher. Again, he not only was the only guy to stop Benny Briscoe, he was also the only person to put Carlos Monzon down. So that's one of the reasons why I would talk about raising that right hand power of his a little bit, even if it means dropping the left hand power a little bit, to kind of compensate, because his right hand was really the lead dog there. But I mean, Valdez, really interesting guy. He got hepatitis in his fight with Bobby Cassidy. His brother was killed in a bar fight the week before his first fight with Carlos Monzon. And he was, according to many people, just very not into that fight. He also had a car accident that messed up his hand. So Valdez kind of had a very eventful journey, to say the least. But Valdez, another one of these guys who, after that top tier of, Hagler, Monzon, Robinson, he's not rated here because I haven't worked out rating the old fighters, but Harry Greb, we're kind of outside of that quartet of the top middleweights. That next tier of guys, I feel like, is fairly tightly packed. And Rodrigo Valdez fits into that. Look up his fight with Benny Briscoe if you want a fun one. Just a really, really good war that Valdez came out on top of. Wrap it up with the Man of Steel, Tony Zale, 1940s champion. Zale's career, a little bit hard to judge in terms of the great middleweights of all time, because Zale lost some prime years to the war. But again, just a really tough guy, considered one of the best body punchers of not in all of history, certainly in the history of the middleweight division. His fight with Rocky Graziano his first fight with him was a terrific battle. The Man of Steel nickname is interesting. He was regarded pretty much universally as an incredibly tough guy, but he's got a bunch of knockout losses in his career. So you'll see his chin rating down there at 86. So he could be dropped. He was a fair defensive fighter. He wasn't particularly fast. He's one of these guys he's kind of a soft 88, and I've used that term to describe some other fighters in here where, an 88 is a very solid rating. And again, the caveat of the overall not really being a great gauge, because at this point, until I know differently, the overall rating is really the average of every single rating on here. And not all these ratings should be given equal status with the other. But when I say somebody is a soft whatever, I kind of mean that there's no standout quality that is pulling them to that rating. There's no one trait that's a real standout plus for them. They're just a good, solid fighter across the board, and I think Zale probably falls into that category. But a very solid fighter, and again, somebody who's going to need the as far as traits or whatever styles go, going to need body punching to be a really significant component of how he's ultimately created when this game finally does come out, and I am able to do so. That will bring to a close the 25 middleweights as I continue to test my ratings formulas for the Esports Boxing Club Fighter Ratings Project. I'm feeling very close to the best I can get them from a formula standpoint, with the understanding that most, if not all, of these fighters are going to need some sort of adjustments once I'm able to play test the game. Again, the goal of this is to get fighters as close as possible to accurate by using a formula setup, solely because that will allow for the very fast creation of kind of version ones of these fighters to populate the available fighter database once Esports Boxing Club is released. These ratings, I confidently believe, are on the whole very good. They are not perfect, and I make no claim as such. There are too many nuances that need to be added. Once I have access to those things from the game, fighter styles, habits, etc., that are going to need to be added once I know what those options are. So this is a foundation. It is not a final. Up next, I'll be moving to the welterweights, doing 25 of them as well. Welterweight's one of my favorite divisions. There are just a ton of great fighters to work with there. While I'm still going to use the Rummy's Corner Ring Magazine Rankings project as a reference point of sorts, which I've mentioned previously, I'm modifying my 25 fighter selection to use this setup starting with the welterweights. First, I'm going to use all of the lineal champions from 1950 onward. So for the welterweights, that starts with Sugar Ray Robinson, and then from there it's Kid Gavilan, Johnny Saxton, Tony DeMarco, Carmen Basilio, Virgil Atkins, Don Jordan, Benny Perrette, Emile Griffith, Luis Manuel Rodriguez, Curtis Cokes, Jose Napoles, Billy Backus, John Stracey, Carlos Palomino, and then you really get a good batch coming. Wilfred Benitez, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran. You move on to the 80s, really well-packed, well-stocked welterweight division. Donald Curry, Lloyd Hunnigan, Jorge Vaca, Marlon Starling, Maurice Blocker, Simon Brown, Buddy McGirt. Moving on from there to Pernell Whitaker, Oscar De La Hoya, Felix Trinidad, Shane Mosley, Vernon Forrest, Ricardo Mayorga, Corey Spinks, Zab Judah, Carlos Baldemir, Floyd Mayweather Jr., and Manny Pacquiao. It will also include the top 5 in the weight class currently, according to boxrec, which obviously leads with Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., as well as Jordanis Ugas, Virgil Ortiz Jr., and Keith Thurman. And then lastly, it will also include anyone on the Rummy's Corner top 25, not included above, which is still a great pack of fighters. Antonio Margarito, Jimmy McLarnin, Pino Cuevas, Ike Quarte, Kell Brook, Fritzy Zivic, Freddie Cochran, Clyde Gray, and Henry Armstrong. And miraculously, despite that list and everything that it included, one guy who does not make that cut, who I would obviously include anyway, is Thomas the Hitman Hearns. So that basically gives me a list of 51 fighters from which to make the next batch of 25. And then the other guys will all get done eventually. But I think obviously there are a lot more people who want to use that. A lot of guys are going to be obvious. I'm going to include all the top guys. People are going to use, Sugar Ray Leonard and Sugar Ray Robinson and, Pernell Whitaker and Felix Trinidad more than they're going to be looking to use Johnny Saxton and Tony DeMarco. I'm aware of that. I mean, those guys will be guys who will ultimately get created, but they're not going to be at the front of the line by any means. Until next time, thank you as always for watching. Kindly subscribe if you haven't yet. Check out my Facebook and Instagram accounts for more stuff from the Legend Sports universe, and follow some of my great fellow creators, particularly tied to ESBC as well, who are given solid updates about the game as they happen. Boxing Fanatico and Study and Juice and Shep and The Pugilist. I've put their links in the description there, but go give those guys likes and follows too, as they're doing great stuff to keep people updated on all that's going with ESBC. I'll do some breakdown stuff about the game eventually, but I'm really kind of tied into, as far as that game goes, tied into this ratings project at the moment. So with that, my friends, be good to each other, and we'll talk soon.